Jennie Kiesling is next, a professor at West Point, and despite her affiliation there, is something of a navalist. At least I first encountered your work because of my interest in Raoul Castex, someone you've translated and written about, a naval theoretician as well. But thank you for joining us as well. Big weekend for you, I know, at the Army Navy game. So
big weekend. Right. Well, somebody's read Castex. You may be the only person who's ever heard of him. I'd like to begin by agreeing with whatever John said. Also, the conditions of my employment at West Point require me to begin by affirming that nothing that I say, and this is perfectly obvious, nothing I say here represents the views of the Department of the Army, the United States Military Academy, or its history department. And when you hear what I'm going to say, you'll understand why. I also want to thank Secretary Carson for this second invitation to talk about On War, and thank those who attended the first talk, because your questions, especially the one about civil-military relations, stimulated the ideas that I'm playing with today, but you too bear no responsibility for them. We need to distinguish between Karl von Clausewitz, the thinker, and On War, the book. The book is obviously brilliant, albeit terrible, and has catalyzed much of the best thinking about war since 1830. This very meeting testifies to On War's continuing value. On War is particularly valuable for its admonitions. No one who has read On War carefully should forget his arguments for the intrinsic superiority of the defense over offense, the power of friction, or the imperative of aligning military means with political ends. But On War, for all of its depth and insight, is a 19th century work. And I went into this in some detail in my previous talk. At this late date, no amount of decoding On War is going to find hidden therein new answers to 21st century problems. We need to read On War, but as I said in October, in the right way and for the right reasons. And all of my talks have a lot of athletic metaphors. I cannot help but think of On War as a superb gymnasium for building intellectual muscle, but such mental exercise is just training, not an end in itself. As I said in my last talk, Clausewitz insisted on the importance of studying war in historical context. I believe he would be the first to admonish us not to let scholarly exegesis of his book distract us from the urgent need to understand our 21st century world. He might also deprecate the use of On War as a shield against some of the harsher realities of that world. Particularly, I think he would deprecate some officers' interpretation of his critical discussion of the relationship between policy and strategy. When, as happens all too frequently today, military operations go well but fail to achieve useful outcomes, it is easy to cite Clausewitz in blaming political leaders for failing to create adequate policy, therefore exonerating military commanders for any responsibility. Clausewitz did say that policy is the job of the government, but he also proposed to put the military commander in the cabinet so he could advise the civilians. Thus, and this is a response to the question I was asked in October, I believe he would have insisted that civilian politicians need professional military help in crafting policy. It ought to be incumbent on the armed forces to provide in each moment of crisis a menu of well-thought-out policy options reflecting both detailed knowledge of the specific circumstances and the wisdom of experience. Who will the authors of that policy menu be? We should be looking not for the best interpreters of On War, but for people with the breadth of knowledge and wisdom to write its 21st century sequel. So where are today's Clausewitzes? Who will write that better book that Chris Bassford demands? When Clausewitz was writing On War, he was about 50 years old, approaching the 40th anniversary of his commissioning, and, I presume, not contemplating retirement. He had seen much combat, but also experienced quieter years of study, teaching, and reflection. I'm not sure that any of today's Army branch reps would sign off on that career plan. Modern planning staffs are composed of bright, youthful, hard-charging field-grade officers rewarded for finding rapid solutions to immediate problems. Their career tracks give them enough time at any one job to grow exhausted, but not to get comfortable. I doubt that Clausewitz would sign up for the motto, do more on less sleep. Even when officers are encouraged to study, they have to do so on a timeline. Just on Wednesday, I heard my department head brag to our superintendent that West Point's uniformed historians achieved their doctorates after a mere 2 years in graduate school, and then, having assumed full-time teaching duties, complete their examinations, dissertation research, and writing in their spare time. To a lazy civilian who spent 7 years completing a PhD after 7 years as an undergraduate, this phenomenal progress is both awe-inspiring and alarming. At the very least, a history PhD achieved under these circumstances is likely to be narrow in conception and unlikely to involve things we might need today, like foreign languages or extensive overseas research. Does it provide time to think? West Point is one place in the Army where one can find a cluster of mature senior officers with the career stability for intellectual effort. It says something about the Army's priorities that each permanent member of the Academy's history department can expect every few years to be sent away from the Academy for 3 to 6 months, not to broaden their intellectual horizons at a university, but to, quote, re-green with an operational unit. I'm looking around, my boss may be here, re-greening. Even I got to spend a summer in Afghanistan. We deprecate 19th century European armies for the antiquity of their officers, among whom Clausewitz was not anything like old, without considering that some jobs, like making higher level strategy and policy, might require the wisdom and perspective of age. But our Army has no one whose job it is simply to ruminate, to grow old and wise while thinking about war and policy from every possible angle. The American officer old and wise enough to write on war has already retired. To conclude, and yes, I am kidding, I think the message of On War is that the Army needs a Clausewitz career field without up or out promotions or mandatory retirement, a career field for thoughtful, intellectually rapacious, but professionally unambitious officers committed to long, sedentary careers of study and reflection.
I'll sign up for that.
One of my clever cadets suggested stationing this SAGE branch in Arizona, but I'm voting for the mountains of Colorado with TDY in Paris, Canberra, and Hawaii. Thank you.
Dr. Kiesling, thank you for those great comments. Really terrific.